So welcome everyone watching to the first episode of the Rising Tide Foundation podcast, where we're going to be making a practice of interviewing various experts, various analysts, and thought leaders from all over the world to discuss matters of history, of culture, of geopolitics, all with the idea of bringing in a better understanding of what makes each world's culture beautiful, great, worth preserving, and really something we want to look for. What is it that makes us all human, with a common human experience, with common aspirations, common hopes, which we find in every culture which is existent on the earth today. One of the big problems today is ignorance, and we know that we have probably the most disastrous set of diplomatic bridges which has been burnt in recent weeks and months, which is really leading to a danger of major confrontation that could get very ugly very quickly between the East and West. The reason why this has been permitted to happen largely has to do with the anti-China sentiment, which has become really pervasive across the entire West. A lot of this is based on a susceptibility to slanders, to false narratives, false mythologies about what China is. And the reason why a lot of good people find themselves susceptible to a lot of this slander, and also giving their consent to military policies that could destroy the world, is because they just don't know. They don't know about the truer full dimensions of the beauty of Asia. So that's why we're so pleased that our friend, our colleague, Jeff Brown, who we've known him for a few years, and Jeff is a prolific writer. He's written several books. He's a writer who runs regular columns on the Greenville Post, on the Saker, on many other journals. He's featured on various media outlets as well. Press TV just is one of amongst many. And he's a prolific interviewer with a very, very amazing oasis of ideas that are presented in this desert on the internet of ignorance. And this oasis is called China Rising Radio Sinoland. This is something which I don't know anybody but Jeff who is able to maintain such an array of constant streams of interviews of experts, of analysts, of historians, and of writers and researchers and diplomats from around the world, constantly to just educate everybody around what is the nature of our history and geopolitics, especially all things China. So most recently, Jeff has written a book, the big red book on China, Chinese history, culture, and revolution, which Cynthia and I have had the pleasure of reading together over the past weeks. So we formulated some questions, and Jeff and Cynthia, I'm going to have you guys take the lead right now. And Cynthia, I think you have a question you want to throw at Jeff.
Sure. Jeff, you've lived an incredibly interesting life, and I think it would be a really great introduction for people who haven't already had the pleasure of getting to know you. If you could speak a little bit about your life experience living in various parts of the world and how this has influenced where you find yourself today and how you place the focus and purpose of your work.
Well, first off, thank you very, very much for doing this. Of course, you know, you talk about experts and great researchers and writers. I've interviewed both of you on China Rising Radio Sinoland, and you all are doing really, really terrific work. So thank you for having me on. I think it's worth kind of going through what my international career, because I think it is a cautionary tale about what Westerners have to go through in order to really find out the truth about the past, the present, and the future. Because on paper, if you look at my CV and all that I've done overseas, you go, wow, what a great career, you know, he's really done a lot, you know. But it wasn't until, in retrospect, you know, when we moved back to China in 2010 that I realized how wrong I was before that time. And so, you know, I 76 to 78, I learned fluent Portuguese and went to Brazil and thought I was a real, of course, luckily it didn't work. I wanted to be a farmer down there. And then 1980 to 82, I joined the Peace Corps, the American Peace Corps, John F. Kennedy. I've lived and worked with peasants and farmers in the mountains of Tunisia. Lived a very simple life, volunteered. And then from 82 to 90, I had a corporate career all over Africa and the Middle East, and I learned French, and of course I learned fluent Arabic. And then in 1990, I got married in 88 to my wife, and then in 1990 to 1997, we moved to China, where I learned fluent Chinese, and I had a wonderful corporate career. And at the end of it all, I had traveled to 88 countries. And so, I really thought I was like really cosmopolitan, and I really thought I really knew what was going on in the world. And I was a good liberal. I subscribed to the Nation magazine and In These Times, and I read, the International Herald Tribune, and The Economist. I really thought I was a really smart guy. I really thought I had the experience, really wonderful experience. But it wasn't until, we moved back, we went to China, we went to France for 5 years, and we're entrepreneurs. We had a retail store, and we went back to the United States from 97 to 2001 to 2010. And, that was a real wake-up call. I saw so much poverty, and I saw so much misery in the United States, and I saw infrastructure just imploding. And then, so I call that my, Bush Obama world. And unfortunately, my wife and I got caught up in what I call the rape of the 99% in 2008. We were in real estate. We lost everything, had a really ugly bankruptcy. And that's what drove us back to China in 2010. And when I got off the airplane in China in 2010, and I saw what had happened in the last 14 years after we left, I was absolutely just stunned. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It was unbelievable. Quonset Hut Airport in Beijing in 1997, and now it was like, this beautiful, of course now they even have a bigger airport, but they have the beautiful Beijing airport. There was so much cognitive dissonance because I was so full of myself up to that time. I was so inculcated with what I later described as the Western racist paradigm, that we are so, we're morally superior, we're spiritually superior, we're intellectually superior, we're technologically superior, we've got all the answers, we know what's best for you. And so for all the people I knew from back in Africa and the Middle East and China up to 1997, I apologize because I was a jerk. I mean, I was a complete and total, elitist, Western, snob. And I'm embarrassed. I'm really embarrassed. And so I spoke fluent Chinese, read and write fluent Chinese. And I probably really upset thousands of people because I traveled all over the country because I was in agriculture. I was obnoxious, and I was obnoxious in the Middle East, and I was obnoxious in Africa. I was obnoxious in Brazil. I was a jerk, a Western jerk. And so, and of course, and I was also anti-communist and anti-socialist, and Western democracy, the superiority of our, I was, and unfortunately, I know people who have lived in China for 30 years, and they still haven't figured it out. So that's what got me really That's when the scales started to fall off my eyes. I saw this country and I was like going, geez, Louise, what is going on? And so I decided to take a trip to the six poorest areas of China. That's my first book. I wasn't even planning on writing a book. I was going to just do a blog. But anyway, I was mostly out in Western China, and I was blown away about what I saw. I mean, I couldn't believe the development and the progress and how much the people had changed and how much the people had grown and how they adapted and thriving and how peaceful it was and how safe it was. And so when I got back, I ended up writing 44 days backpacking in China. And that was my first, that was my first effort to try to understand China. I still had this liberal, this liberaloid notion up to that point. But it was finally when I wrote my second book, China Rising, Capitalist Roads, Socialist Destinations, because I studied the West, I figured, well, I cannot really understand China until I really understand the truth about the West. And I know we want to concentrate on China today, but that book, I did a ton of research on the West. It was mostly not a very pretty picture. And so that really kind of put everything together, all my vaunted Western superiority just completely disintegrated. And then I saw this communist socialist country just roaring like a high-speed train. It was just unimaginable for me. And so then we continued to live there. And then 3 years later, I wrote a big red book on China, I expanded my research, not so much on the West, but really on China. How does China work? Past, present, and future. And it's been a life-changing experience for me. And I now really understand the Chinese. I understand all about the what seems like a chaotic, like just constant movement, noisy, crowded. And now I understand that it's basically a sort of a tapestry, of chaos that it works. They know how to work in tight places. They know how to work with a lot of people. They know how to weave and bob and wait and do whatever they need to do, because there's basically there's 1.2 billion people living in the eastern half of the country in an area the size of Europe. And so now all these common racist ideas, oh, they are so disorganized, and oh, they're so noisy, and oh, they're so pushy, and they're impolite. If they bump into you, they don't say excuse me, and all these other ridiculous things. They're too busy, they're working, they're going places. You bump into 100 people a day, you just keep going. Who cares? And it actually was an experience when I was swimming at the public swimming pool, and there were no lanes, and there were frequently 100 people in that pool. And I all of a sudden I realized, well, because they're just going in different directions, and clockwise and counterclockwise and horizontally and vertically and diagonally, and because of that, and they just weave and bob, and no one worries about anything. And if you bump into somebody, you just keep going. It was then that I realized, well, because of that, 100 people can be in this pool and it works. Because otherwise, I remember I was at a pool in New Orleans at an exclusive men's club that a guy got me a pass into, and there were 4 lanes, and there were 4 swimmers. And this old man was sitting there like a hound dog waiting for a line. You know, and he finally gave up and left. Well, if that was China, there'd be 4 or 5 people in each lane, and they'd be working with each other and cooperating with each other and working together, maximum productivity and maximum efficiency.
Mhm.
So it's just been an amazing experience, and I can't wait to go back. Unfortunately, with COVID, it's been a real nightmare. But hopefully by by fall, August, September, October, I can go back. I've been to almost every province, but in China, but I would like to go back and start traveling there again because it's absolutely, as I always like to say, the greatest show on earth. So here I am.
Great. No, that's wonderful. And I mean, I think you always get to know the most about somebody based upon their transformations. That was really wonderful and generous of you to go through that experience of your own metroization and self-awareness.
Oh yeah.
Especially when conflicting with the ugly realities that a lot of us are not privy to. I mean, some things are just sitting in front of our faces, and we just don't see it because of other, various cultural dynamics that we're influenced by that we're not even fully aware in our conscious. And our friend, we have a friend who's, he was a Chinese student here in Canada for many years, and he would always go back to China once a year to visit his family, and he'd come back after a couple of weeks, and he would say, nothing is moving. The roads are getting worse. There's no change happening in what I thought previously was the most developed society of the world. There's the bumpiest, worst roads. Bridges are collapsing. It's stagnant. And
Mm-hmm.
every time he goes back once a year to China, it was like a new nation he was walking into. It's the same airport. But, so yeah, no, it's absolutely stark.
When
But
we
now,
used to travel and leave China, like to go back to France or the United States for vacation, and we'd be, I'm not kidding. We would be sitting there, we were going, was that building there before? Just like, was that skyscraper there before? I mean, there's just like Shenzhen is building more skyscrapers than the entire United States, and that's just one city.
yeah,
And
right.
so, there's just this like high-speed train transformation going on in China that's just unbelievable. But
Oh
anyway.
yeah, yeah. On the issue of history, because you were bringing up the importance of researching the deeper history of different societies that you want to understand. And in your book, the Big Red Book on China, Chinese History, Culture, and Revolution, which everyone should buy who's listening to this podcast, you start off with a summary overview of Chinese ancient history. Admiral Zheng He is very, very famous in China. He had made several incredible voyages from 1405 to 1433. Along China's southern coastline and Africa's eastern coastline during the Ming Dynasty. That was 3 generations before Columbus. Now,
Mhm.
could you say a few words on why these voyages were so incredible and how China interacted with different cultures it came into contact with for the first time?
Yeah, it's really it's an amazing story, and it really paints an accurate picture about the real China and the real Chinese even today. His flotillas were absolutely massive, up to 300 ships, not three, the Santa Maria and, like Columbus, not 3 little ships, 300 ships, many times the size of 15th century European boats. Believe it or not, at least one of his flotillas, he traveled with up to 25,000 members in his 300 boat flotilla. These massively huge boats. That 25,000 people on the water at the same time, that was half the population of London at that time. Half the population of one of the biggest cities in Europe. I mean, Columbus's boats would have been okay for kitchen ships, to peel potatoes. That's about it. And military and technologically at that time in the early 1400s, China was centuries ahead of everywhere they traveled. I mean, they had chemical weapons and and rocket propelled grenades and guns and cannons and mines. They could float mines in the water. They were so far ahead of everywhere they went. It's just, it boggles the mind. They could have crushed everyone that they met in all those ports across southern Asia, the Arabian Peninsula, and the east coast of Africa. They could have crushed everybody like bugs. They could have marched. They could have marched across Africa and into Europe, and just wiped out Europe if they wanted to. But instead, what did the Chinese do? They brought books, and they wanted to, they had like 200. They had two sets of 200 books. Sets of 200 books. Let me turn off my Outlook because it just made a noise. They had sets of 200 books, so that they gave those as gifts. They did trading. They exchanged technology. They practiced diplomacy. They left emissaries in all the ports, and they brought back ambassadors to China for cultural and scientific exchanges. I mean, can you imagine that? And yet they had the power to take over the world.
And Europe was going through a dark age.
Yeah, exactly. And China, so what I learned is, and I came up with this idea, China does not have the 6 E's of Western racism in their DNA, or we would all be using chopsticks and speaking Mandarin today. And I call the 6 E's of Western racism: expansionism, expropriation, extraction, extermination, enslavement, and evangelism. We really want to convert everybody to be like us, and so they don't.
You could call it the 6 dis-eases.
Then furthermore, I think it goes beyond that. I think it goes beyond just the east coast of Africa. For 10 years, I never read Gavin Menzies' books because, it's just BS. It's just not true. It can't be. It's just full of lies. And so I finally read his first book, 1421, and then his 1434. And you really have to go into, you have to really compartmentalize your brain and go into deep denial to not accept the fact that Zheng He did not stop in the Indian Ocean, but look at the flotillas he had, but sailed on into the Atlantic and landed in the Americas well before Columbus and Company. And everybody should read those 2 books. But then in even
just to make a quick note too, because I haven't gotten around to reading Gavin Menzies' books, but
they're really good. 1434 is a little bit more speculative, but 1421, you really have to put on blinders to say no.
Okay, but I have heard that they're like the natives in what is now the United States, that they found relics of like Chinese forms of Chinese writing that the natives had access to. So that's
and like in Guatemala, they were making they discovered they're making Joseph Needham, found they were making red and black lacquer boxes. And out of the 22 steps to make them, 21 were the exact same steps in China. You really have to go into La La Land to deny it. But even for me, even more persuasive is Charlotte Harris Reese, and I got her 3 books, and the first one is Secret Maps of the Ancient World. And I mean, she convincingly shows that the Chinese were in the Americas back in 2200 BC. And this is based on everything from DNA to archaeology written Chinese documents to maps. I mean, we don't have time to go into it, but I think the Chinese have been in the Americas way, 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 way longer than we ever thought. And again, this is all part of also the idea. In fact, I even wrote about it when I was on the Tibetan plateau, what they call the Tibet to Pueblo connection. There's a lot, there's a lot of Asiatic traits especially among the Western West Coast Native Americans, a lot of Asiatic traits. But anyway, again, I think she's right. I mean, it's so overwhelming, the evidence that you read her 3 books and you're like going, my gosh. And again, if they were going to North America, 2,200 BC, if they had our Western DNA of expansionism and expropriation and extermination and extraction, etc., again, we would all be Chinese now, but we're not, because that is absolutely not in their DNA. So whether we just limit it to Zhenghe, or we want to go out to Zhenghe, going around the Cape of Good Hope over to the Americas, which I think he probably did for sure, and then Charlotte Harris Reese, going back even two millennia before Jesus Christ. It all proves that the Chinese do not have imperial ambitions. And so when people sit there and say, oh, well, when the America crashes, the Chinese are just going to be the same way. That's not true. I mean, after 5,000 years, are they going to change today? Just like magic? No, it's just not their way of doing business and conducting trade and diplomacy. So that's what I learned with Zheng He.
Along that note, if you could, I mean, we're already talking about it, but China has been probably the most advanced civilization for most of the history of human existence, which I know is hard for some people to hear, but it was really only until the 1800s with the Opium War that China went through their century of humiliation. But I think it's really important for people to understand why China today is no different from the China that you've been describing in a more distant history, specifically because of this idea of upholding the heavenly mandate. And I think a lot of Westerners don't understand the importance of this and how it's always been important in China, including today.
Well, you are absolutely right, except for the 110 years of the West century of humiliation, 1839 to 1949. For the last 5,000 years, China has been the leading center for technology, innovation, invention, infrastructure, grand projects, just unbelievably, ambitious projects. They were so far ahead, steel, iron, just mechanical things, clocks and things like. They were so far ahead of the way, especially agriculturally, about 1,500 years ahead of Europe. And it was not just China. And I do want to point this out, because this is also something. In 1839, China had 25% of the global GDP. By 1874, after the West completely, raped and pillaged it and got, a quarter of the people addicted to opiates, its global GDP fell to 6%, and it stayed that way until the 1950s. But it was India, also 1839, they also had 25% of the global GDP. And by the 1880s, it was down to 2%. So before European colonialism, China, India, and Africa, and Arabia all had advanced societies, economies, and technology. And so just to kind of put things in perspective, in 200 AD, at the height of the Roman Empire, China had 9 times the population and 6 times the land area of the Roman Empire.
Wow.
I mean, just let those numbers sink in. Rome declined from that point. Western Roman Empire collapsed to, what was it, 1413 or whatever, and it managed to hang on until 1533, until the Germans finally killed them off. But China went from that 200 AD, China went to even greater heights in the Tang and Song dynasties and on into the Yuan dynasty, up into the Middle Ages. So the people, when Marco Polo wrote his book, he was there during the Song dynasty, and he saw things. Of course, a lot of it's a bit fanciful, but he was there for 20 something years, and he saw things that that were just unimaginable in the West. And as Cynthia said, Europe was trying to crawl out of the Dark Ages. So I really want to recommend to everybody watching this program today to read 2 books, and the first one is Robert Temple's The Genius of China, 3,000 Years of Science, Discovery, and Invention. It was actually written for the Queen of England to celebrate Hong Kong's handover in 1997. And and the other book is John A. Hobson's Eastern Origins of Western Civilization, whom I interviewed. He's in England. Temple's book is based on Dr. Joseph Needham's monumental work on ancient China. And Needham conservatively estimated that no less than 60% of modern Western technology was taken directly from the Chinese. I mean, they just absorbed it. And in my books, I write extensively about China being centuries and sometimes even more than a millennium ahead of the West in many phases of technology. So you're right, Cynthia. People just we have been sold this bill of goods. We have been sold this bill of goods that that China is the sick man of Asia, and China, is all they do is copycat, and no, that's not true. It's all just Western superiority propaganda. And let me tell you, this is a very interesting story where this Western superiority came from. Up until about the 1680s, everybody agreed that China was a great culture and an advanced culture. And up until the 1680s, Western Enlightenment was infatuated with Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism, with philosophers as diverse as Voltaire and Gottfried Leibniz and Christian Wolff being big fans, and the latter two who heavily influenced Immanuel Kant. So Confucius, this Chinese philosophy, the triangle of Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism, was a really important influence in Western Enlightenment in the first part of the 1600s. And ironically, it was the 16th century Jesuits who brought back all this Chinese philosophy. And 150 years later, the European establishment and Protestantism and Catholicism felt threatened by its increasing influence and popularity. And so instead of rallying around like a unique cultural identity, let's be Europeans, let's be, like what the Chinese would do, they did what Euranglo land, and for me, Euranglo land is, North America, Europe, the Five Eyes, Israel. They did what they do best. They attacked Islam as a way to reject all things foreign as well as Chinese. And really, the 1680s was the start of this Western racist superiority paradigm. And unfortunately, we are still living with this, this Western modus operandi in today's headlines and beyond. We have all the answers. We're better than you.
And they also said that the emperor had to like convert to Christianity if he was to continue to have like an interaction with the Western influence. Yeah. And of course, at that point, the emperor is like, no.
Yeah.
Right. The rights controversy and all that.
Our evangelicism and our just absolute arrogance, is just, it knows no bounds. I'm sorry, it knows no bounds. And unfortunately, it's still true today, and we can see that with the neoliberals and the neocons, and trying to take over the world, I found that, in fact, I learned that about the 1680s. That was from John Hobson when I read his book and interviewed him. So, yes, sir, and yes, ma'am.
All right. The next question we have for you is the Russia-China-Iran alliance. This is so big
deal. Yeah,
and so important, and the West is freaking out over it because they can only see it as a threat to their existence, and they don't have an ability to understand that this is actually a beautiful thing, and it's ultimately an alliance built on peace and collaboration for survival in the sense of building a future together, not survival in the sense of wanting to militarize and attack, who's opposing them. Of course, they have the right to defend themselves, and that shouldn't be questioned. But a lot of people think that this alliance is a geopolitical convenience. It's quite remarkable that Russia, being Orthodox Christian primarily, China is a socialist with Chinese characteristics, and Iran is Muslim. Maybe you could say something to explain to people who are maybe struggling to understand this alliance as something other than a threat, why these countries that are so different or diverse from each other genuinely want to work together to build a common future.
Yeah, that's a really good question, Cynthia. I have recently, I came up with a new neologism. I love neologisms like Baba Beijing and Yang Land. And this one is the CSAI countries. In fact, I got it from a fan who contacted me in the comment section on my website, meaning communist, socialist, anti-imperial, countries. And China, Russia, and Iran are all anti-imperial. That's for sure. China is communist, socialist. In Iran, believe it or not, a lot of people don't realize it, but Iran is socialist first, with Islamic characteristics second. And Russia still has a huge continuation of the USSR's socialism and its economy and society. And we also cannot forget that Russia and China both have big Muslim populations as well. So, but as you suggested, the glue that binds them all, along with a number of other countries, and we can talk about the DPRK, Vietnam, Cuba, Venezuela, Eritrea, and Africa, and now Bolivia and Argentina are back in the saddle. The common rejoinder is anti-Western imperialism, and I think most of the world's peoples are just sick and tired of what I call the Bretton Woods International Monetary Fund, World Bank dictatorship, and are really seeking, a forward-thinking, win-win, mutually beneficial multipolar world. And any attempt by these CSAI countries to repeat Western imperialism, they know it's doomed to failure. They know that, and they are philosophically opposed to it. And so hell or high water, we've got to, I think the Russians realize this. I think the Chinese realize this, and I think Iran realizes this. We have got to share our pale blue dot, as Carl Sagan used to call it, the Earth, for the human race to survive. And I think this, it includes China, Russia, and Iran individually, and as as unofficial allies, in common cause. And then you asked about, I think, the Chinese dream is just that: win, win, and mutually beneficial relationships. And that's basically it. It's not just those three countries, although it's an incredible. And I predict that Russia and Iran are going to do something similar to what the Chinese and the Iranians did. I thought it was really funny. Or I don't know if it was intentional or not, but the 400 billion price tag, or the value of the new China-Iran agreement was $400 billion. That just so happens to be the same amount of money that the Power of Siberia project was with Russia and China back in 2014. So I don't know if they did that just to kind of like, as a reminder. It wasn't 350, it wasn't 425. It was exactly the same amount as the Power of Siberia, the big gas project with China and Russia back in 2014. So yeah, it's amazing. And the days of the West just raping and plundering Africa, raping and plundering Latin America, raping and plundering Asia, raping and plundering Oceania. It's getting really, really hard. And I would say, China's, communist socialist liberation in 1949, I think is a huge reason, for that, because that's at the time 25% of the world's population, and they have not been able to put a dent in China since. So I think it's all very encouraging. Listen to all the people out there who are worried that Russia and China are going to take over the world and rape and plunder you like the West has been raping and plundering the rest of the planet, for the last 500 years. That it's just not in the Chinese DNA. And no matter how, and let's just say, okay, well, maybe not China, but what about Russia? Well, first off, Russia, except when they were, so the Soviet USSR, fighting the United States and the West for geopolitical supremacy, Russia really hasn't shown any, they expanded out, into Western, into Eastern Asia, Vladivostok and etc. But they haven't gone all around the world, conquering entire countries and stuff. It's just, I don't think it's in their DNA either. Mm-hmm. And Iran just wants to take care of its own people. That's all.
I think an important point to make is that, Europe is a bit of a different situation, but especially Americans, they haven't really gone through a war on their own, native land, whereas these countries are constantly having to have recently gone through war on their land, but also have to constantly deal with real threats of instability circling around them. And, when countries go through this, you don't take war lightly. And believe it or not, for Americans, but you do want to just have stability and peace when you've gone through the kind of destruction and terror that war causes, which these countries are all extremely familiar with. And I think that this collaboration it has to occur because they have to stand up. It's not just for those countries, but they're standing up for all the other countries
Less
that
powerful,
have not
less
been
powerful.
able, to,
I
you know,
agree.
what was going on in Europe during World War II, Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe was left to fend for itself individually. There was a denial to allow an alliance to form, and that's also what imperialism does. It
Hmm.
forbids an alliance that is not dictated by the Western imperialist alliance,
Hmm.
and it's a peaceful form of resistance. So
Hmm.
it's really great that
Mhm.
Russia, China, and Iran are doing this for the world. Really, the world is really, I think, seeing this, and they have hope now that
Mhm.
possibly,
Hmm.
the world will no longer go through this kind of horror that's been going on almost nonstop now for over 100 years.
Hmm. Absolutely. Let me just be a devil's advocate for the war in the war in North America, because if you're a Native American,
Yeah.
You might have a different opinion.
yeah, war is very, very real. And
Mhm.
Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's book, Native Americans, history of North America. She said in 1607, when they landed in Jamestown, they they started killing them and wiping them out, and they haven't stopped since. So I do want to recognize that if, yeah, for the victors, yeah, we haven't really had the majority population. We haven't really had a Syria over the War of 1812. Well, the Civil War was a bloody disaster. And that was a lot of people died there. But you're right. We have not been invaded, and we have not had to fend off, a serious foreign force. There was the War of 1812, and but it's yeah. But you're right. It's Americans have no concept of being occupied again, unless you're Indian, Mexican, etc. But yeah, that's very, very true. Let's be positive for the Russia, China, Iranian alliance, because it's just absolutely making it extremely difficult for Western neocons right now to try to break into it.
Mhm. Yeah, we've all seen these images online of Russia and China putting their nations so close to all of these NATO U.S. military
Yeah,
bases,
yeah, yeah,
and
yeah,
it's
yeah,
just
yeah,
shocking, right?
yeah.
You can only imagine if Europe or the United States had to deal with Chinese and U.S. military bases surrounding them, how would they react? It would be a
Yeah,
very different world.
exactly. Yeah.
And we're only shown the one aspect of, yes, China and Russia have military preparations, so does Iran, yes, but we're being fed in our media as if these are aggressive, offensive operations, whereas no,
Yeah.
take the context as a whole into your mind, and these are entirely defensive, reactionary. They don't want this. So yeah, I think that this whole idea is very, very important. And the idea of this actually gets at my question that I want to throw at you now. Again, with a little bit of some historical twist, China's currently going through a certain revival of a 1920 development strategy put forth by the founding father of the Republic of China, the great revolutionary Sun Yat-sen. I forgive me if my pronunciation is bad
That's
to all of the
okay.
Chinese
That's
speakers out
okay.
there.
I never say anything.
But yeah, many people don't know that Sun Yat-sen was not only, I mean, obviously, yes, he was the guiding light behind the 1911 revolution that established a republic, overthrew the dynastic system, but also is the 1920 author of a thorough development strategy that he authored called the International Development of China, with rail, ports, all sorts of incredible development, much of which has blossomed under the form of the Belt and Road Initiative. And you make a point in your book that, and it's very provocative, especially for a Western audience, that Sun Yat-sen had understood and adopted certain communist teachings because he was, as you say, a true follower of the teachings of Jesus
Mhm.
Christ.
Mhm.
And again, for many
Absolutely.
Westerners thinking about China, this is a bit of a mind blower. Now, I'd like you to further elaborate a little bit on this, why Sun Yat-sen would not see a contradiction between the teachings of Christ and the teachings of communism. And if you can, if you could also say a few words on how Abraham Lincoln also inspired Sun Yat-sen. We've got pictures of Lincoln and Sun Yat-sen on these
I've
World
read your
War II
articles.
stamps. Yeah.
I've read your articles on the Rising Tide Foundation about that. So, well, yeah, for me, you know, it's glossed over in the West, but Jesus's teachings were very communistic. I mean, in the sense of sharing the commonwealth and economic equality. I mean, the reason he was killed is because he attacked the equivalent of the 1% of his times by throwing the bankers out of the temples. I mean, they couldn't this upstart revolutionary. I mean, he was basically a revolutionary of his time, and it was top to bottom redistribution of wealth, and so he had to go. So I always say that Jesus was a communist, even though it really upsets people in the West. But Sun Yat-sen, he converted to Christianity and he was a westernized elite. I mean, there's no doubt about that. Nonetheless, his three principles of the people that he wrote, which was basically the platform for the Kuomintang, for his Kuomintang, was rejecting foreign domination was number one, which is also a very, very Christian. Stand up, stand up. Stand up for your people. Number two, people's rights. The people's rights, and number three, communitarianism, which is a sort of a variant of communism without all the politics. I mean, those are not only New Testament, but they're really communist too. And Swin's GMD party was avowedly, this is something that again is all just been kind of flushed down the historical toilet, but was avowedly communist. I mean, they worked closely with the Communist International. I mean, and this continued until his untimely death in 1925, and when unfortunately his gangster fascist successor Chiang Kai-shek took over. So he invited the Communist International to come in to China and completely revamp the GMDs, their whole policies, etc. So he was definitely in the communist camp. I mean, there's no doubt about that. You all are the experts on Lincoln. I mean, I've read your some of your pieces about Lincoln, and I'll let maybe you all can explain, Lincoln and Sun Yat-sen. But clearly, Swin wasn't about Christian. He wasn't about communist. And for me, the commonality between the two are very clear. So please tell us about Lincoln and Sun Yat-sen, one of you.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the thing that I think struck me, and you brought up the three principles of the people, which Sun Yat-sen was, while he was a student, a young man in Hawaii, he was definitely influenced by networks affiliated with the Whig Party and the New Republican Party of Lincoln. A lot of these economists that were tied to Lincoln's advisors, like Henry Carey, and the idea of a nation for, by, and of the people was what the guiding light of Lincoln, and that's how he read and understood the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and the principles of political economy that he put into force that were in opposition to British free trade, which he was always in opposition to, as were many of the greatest patriots. And this involved things like the utilization of protective tariffs, protectionism, the investments into long-term projects like the Transcontinental Railway. So the idea that money had to obey the needs of the nation and the general welfare, as well as support the needs of the individual citizens. So that was sort of the idea of natural law, or that Lincoln, many of the leading figures of the 19th century America, before the communist versus capitalist sort of schism really took over in the 20th century, especially with the Cold War, that was really the understanding that you had this anti-imperial form of political economy and an imperial form. And, they didn't have the words so much in practice at the time, like communism, socialism, capitalism. Those were not things. It was like imperialism or anti-imperialism. And so Sun Yat-sen sort of, I think, studied the best elements of that when he formulated his idea of the three principles upon which the nation would be meritorious of having authority and survive, and the moral fitness to survive. And I think his development strategies, he was very, very clear that the idea of industrializing, having very, 10, 20-year projects defining your investments. It was very, very much synergistic with both what the best of the US was before it started taking more of an imperial turn, unfortunately, and that's probably the topic for another podcast. And also much more in synergy with the best elements of socialism as we see expressed today under China's leadership with the BRI.
For sure. Yeah. Thank you for that. I did not know all the details about that with Lincoln and Sun Yat-sen. Yeah, it's too bad. He was hunkered down in Guangzhou, in Guangdong, in the southern part of the country. He just could not face up to the warlords to the north, and he struggled. He was very visionary. He was a brilliant person, but to be a revolutionary and make changes takes extraordinary. It's a rare talent.
Yeah.
And he just didn't have. He just didn't. I mean, he had all the ideas, and I said that in the book. He was a wonderful person, a wonderful leader. He just didn't have the moxie to take on the warlords. And then unfortunately, he got gallbladder cancer and died in 1925. So and we'll never know. We'll never know at this point. But that's why he is adopted by both the communists and the Kuomintang with Chiang Kai-shek. Well, I think when you know about Sun Yat-sen, you know about his past, and you know about the founding of the GMD being very communist. I think of course Chiang Kai-shek and his merry band of gangsters had to adopt him, when they for Taiwan. But he is officially, the father of the People's Republic of China, or maybe not the father, but the inspiration,
precursor,
the precursor, and then of course the Taiwan and Chiang Kai-shek adopted him, as sort of like the founding father of the Republic of China. So interesting guy.
Plus, then you have the element too of Western intelligence operations throughout the 20th century, with their fingers all over China as well. So you don't just have the internal dynamics that Sun Yat-sen was dealing with, but you also have these foreign manipulations, which are very sophisticated. So it's a very complex process of history. All right, just a quick follow up on that. I'd like you to maybe explain in a few words how China's government actually functions practically a little bit. And that's a big thing to ask. So let me just clarify that a bit. Why is it that despite the Chinese people not specifically voting for their president directly, they do still have a voice, arguably stronger of a voice than many things that we see in the democratic Western system, through the constant polling of its people's complaints? And if you could also explain how Xi earned his position as president of China, since this is very mystified for a lot of Westerners.
Yeah.
And through a few words, maybe, if possible, what is Xi thought that we hear so much of, but it's again not clear for Westerners what this is. What is this phenomenon?
Well, I have, and of course, again, I didn't realize this until I got back in 2010 and wrote my, even in 44 days, I was still very much in that, anti-communist, anti-socialist mode, and that Mao was an evil, an evil dictator. But finally, with China Rising, I did so much research and learned so much. But what's important to understand is that Chinese democracy goes goes back before it was liberated by communism in 1949. And in a nutshell, Chinese governance has always been based on ethics, not morals, because morals are very judgmental. But your moral is different from my morals, so mine's right and yours is wrong. Whereas ethics is just simply respecting the golden rule. Do not do unto others what you do not want done to you. And that is basically the foundation of Chinese government. And Chinese leaders have confidence in their people to realize this ideal. And through the heavenly mandate, the people trust their leaders to do the right thing for them with this ethical golden rule, unless shown otherwise. And in that case, that's somewhere in Big Red Book on China, I even gave the Chinese characters for it, but there's even a phrase in Chinese which means the people pick up their bamboo spears and storm the local government offices or all the way up to the national palace to demand new leaders if they do not satisfy the demands of the people, which is peace, prosperity, and maintaining the national borders of the country. This has
It
been
is really
going
not
on.
so different from the United States concept either of the government of
No,
the
it's
people, by
true.
the people, for the people, that the people
True.
should
That's very true, Cynthia.
overthrow the government if they're not
Yeah,
upholding
exactly.
justice.
Absolutely. You're absolutely right.
Not that we're advocating overthrowing the government right now, just to be clear for anybody listening, what read that.
And furthermore, Mao was adopted a lot of ancient practices. Leaders were expected, this has been going on for thousands of years, leaders were expected to send out official representatives whatever territory they controlled and governed, they were expected to send out official representatives and incognito agents across the land to go into bars and hotels and restaurants and farms and villages to hear the grievances and check the reality on the ground. So with Mao's mass line, and that being Baba Beijing, and that's my affectionate name for China's leadership, Mao's mass line was and still is constantly talking to the people from all walks of life, hearing their wants and needs, and then making them policies and laws that fit those aspirations. And so right now, since 1949, Chinese democracy is on popular steroids, because they do millions and millions and millions and millions of surveys and polls, and now it's all. I mean, I could even go online and make suggestions about this in my neighborhood, and I've seen it and I've heard it with my own eyes. So I have the experience to know. And so, as far as elections are concerned, the PRC practices local direct democracy and then indirect democracy at the county, provincial, and national levels. And so first, China has local village community elections every 3 years in almost 1 million locales around the country, and including my neighborhood. I can sit there and see the candidates posted, et cetera, in my neighborhood. Interestingly, 2/3 of them are not members of the CPC. And so most of the local people and these local committees, town committees, village committees, neighborhood committees, etc. They 2/3 of them are not even CPC members, and so at this point it becomes indirect. These local governments, and in our neighborhood, we had a picture of the representative for our little block of apartments, and mobile phone number, where to go to to talk to them, where to go to, about their background, who they are, what they do, are they a teacher or whatever. I've seen that all over China. These local governments, these town committees and village committees, neighborhood committees, they vote for their county governments. Then this latter, in turn, vote for the provincial legislature, the committees, and the provincial units vote for the National People's Congress in Beijing, 3,000 members. And again, I'd like to point out that 1/3 of them are not CPC members. So in fact, compared to most Western states, Chinese people's legislative representation is much more diverse. And this and with its parallel executive branch, you may have heard of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, the CPPCC. It's a mouthful. And that covers just about every lobby group in the country, from unions to farmers to business people, small business people, women's groups. I mean, I think I list them in the and Big Red Book on China. And while this is all going on, remember, at all these levels, Mao's mass line is in full swing, something I experience daily when living with the Chinese and traveling all over the country. I mean, there's just notices up in, we want to interview middle-aged women, blah, 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 about, we want to interview, people, about, breast exams, or we want to interview people about garbage collection, or we want to talk to people about what you think about, the look of our neighborhood, et cetera. So, but now here is something also that Westerners do not want to acknowledge. Just like in the West, where the unwritten rule is no one is going to be elected who threatens Western capitalism, Baba Beijing draws the line on no one trying to overthrow the people's communist socialist way of life. That's all, but it's no different than in the West. They're not going to let some fire-breathing, communist become president of the United States. It will never happen. They'll kill him before he ever even gets near it. So now that's the legislative part. For the executive branch, Xi Jinping, it's very similar. They're all elected, but the National People's Congress, these 3,000 elected members, they vote for the 300-person Central Committee, which is, so it's like a pyramid. And so this is where they do a lot of discussion, a lot of policy, a lot of debate, etc. Then the Central Committee votes for the 25-member Politburo. So now we're like to the 25 most powerful people in the Chinese government, and which in turn elects a 6 to 9 member. It just depends on what period in since 19, it's been 6 to 9 members, the Politburo Standing Committee. So these 6 to 9 members, I think in Xi's it's 7 or 8, but this is like the most powerful people in terms of directing the country. And it is this standing committee that elects the president, who is today Xi Jinping. So he was elected after this rigorous, meritocracy, all the way from the village level up to the National People's Congress, the Central Committee, the Politburo, all the way up to the Standing Committee. And all of these, and after these consultations, so when Xi became president, then after all these consultations, the President Xi nominated the premier, and which is Li Keqiang. And so he is then, so President Xi recommends Li Keqiang, and it's an up or down vote. Either it's yes or no, and if it were no, he'd have to find somebody else. But that's not going to happen in China because they spend months and months and months, going through this rigorous, selection process of meritocracy. And with Xi, the premier has been Li Keqiang. He's often overlooked, and he oversees the country's executive branch and the CPPCC. And for me, he is easily one of the world's most experienced, most effective executive leaders. And I mean, you take Xi and Li together. I mean, they are an unbeatable dynamic duo. I mean, they really represent the interests of China's 99%. So, that's how it works, in very, 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 very general terms.
Yeah, that's super useful because I mean, as well, a lot of people are aware that in the West, which likes to celebrate itself as being wonderfully superior because of our democratic institutions, it's well known that there's such demoralization that you're lucky to get 35% voter turnout in most Western elections, including here in Canada or the United States. And if you poll most people, they don't really think, they think it's popularly understood that corporate interests, other private interests, dominate policymaking, and it's not the will of the people. The disenchantment level is very, very as high as it's ever been. So
you
it's a
vote
bit of
for
a
the president, and then after that, regardless of what the president promised, it's like the president can decide to keep those promises or not, and you have to wait another 4 years and see, do I want to stick with this person or do I want to go with the next person? Maybe they'll follow the promises after a second term. Like it's ridiculous. It encourages lying to the people because there's just no pressure to keep any kind of policy going for the betterment.
Well, look at Obama. He had like a platform of 100 promises, and about the only one he kept was gay marriage. Thank you. With everything else going on in the country, and that's all you can come up with. I mean, come on, give me a break.
Yeah, Biden's following through on gender realignment for children. That's like they'll stand firm to that one, but I'll talk of justice economically or otherwise, forget about it.
I want you to go through explaining to people what it means, democratic dictatorship of the people, which obviously sounds like an oxymoron to Westerners. If you could explain what that process is in China, and also go through your really captivating Steve McQueen story, that your high-speed chase.